Here we go live. So welcome everyone to Meshery Development Meeting. Today is 31st of May. And if you are a newcomer, haven't introduced to the community yet, this is your chance. You can unmute yourself and give a quick introduction. I'm just taking a quick glance at the participants list. So I just find one. So Tejas, is this your first time joining this call or you have been here?
Yeah, I am joining for the first time.
Oh, that's great. So let's have your quick introduction. Would you like to introduce?
Yeah, sure.
Sure, go ahead, Tejas.
Yeah. So hello everyone. I am Tejas Jamdade. I am currently a third year undergraduate student pursuing my bachelor's in technology at IIT Jodhpur. And recently I have been exploring service meshes, and that's why I started contributing to Meshery, I guess. I am passionate about DevOps and security. I've been working in this area for a long time now, and I've done a couple of projects in this area. And I would like to work on some exciting projects with Meshery and Layer 5 with all you exciting developers. Let's see.
That's awesome. Nice to have you, Tejas. Welcome to the community and to the Meshery Development Meeting. I see it's your first time joining this call and you already have a PR to discuss. That's so nice.
Yeah.
Cool.
Thanks.
So I don't think we have more newcomers today. So with that, let's start today's meeting. I'll share the meeting minutes again if you missed it earlier. So first up, let's talk about starring the GitHub repository, Meshery/Meshery. So if you haven't started the Meshery repository yet, make sure you give it a star and do share it with your friends, and do let your friends know to share it with their friends. So let's build this. Let's get more stars on Meshery repository. And next up is publish your first design into the Meshery catalog, and we'll definitely celebrate it with a tweet from the Meshery IO Twitter account. So if you haven't published your any design in the Meshery catalog, make sure you publish. And if you get any kind of issues while publishing into catalog from Meshery from Playground, so do let us know in Discuss forum or in Slack in Meshery extension channel. We'll definitely help you out. So with that, let's move with today's topic. So first up on the list, we have Pranav on Persist MeshModels Policies in database on server boot. So Pranav, would like to share?
Yep.
Good.
Okay, so my topic is about persisting mesh model policies when Meshery servers start for the first time. First of all, to give a little bit of context on this is that mesh model is a known construct of Meshery that is used for defining new integrations. And inside of mesh models, there are different more constructs, more child constructs, whether it's mesh model, whether it's components, whether it's policies, whether it's relationship, and now there is a new concept that is policies. And basically these are integrated to one another for enhancing the functionality of Meshery. As of today, Meshery is about 150 plus integrations. You can check that out on the documentation as well. And like this PR basically helps in persisting of policies. Currently, like before this PR, the issue was that we were not persisting our policies like we persist our components and relationship in the database. So Meshery has its own local database, which is an SQL database, and that is used for persisting these mesh models, and then they're retrieved from the database. But policies was not supporting this thing. So this PR adds supports for that. And what this PR more things in this PR is that the second thing is that exposes more APIs for fetching mesh model policies, so that mesh model browsers can also take this and use this functionality and enhance the current UI. Because currently in mesh model browser, if you could go to your settings page, you'll see that only models and components are exposed. We can also add the function, also expose the policies after this PR. So we just need to fetch the API and then we can use that. And the other thing covered in this PR is the updation of Vigo policy evaluation. Basically, what this does is that earlier we were using we were having a repo file which we were passing to a Meshery function that evaluates the policy which was specific for network evaluation, and it was returning the different relationship between different components of a Helm chart. So what this PR basically does is that does the exact same thing, but instead of passing a static repo file, what we pass is the expression stored in the database, and then the same thing is performed. And one last thing which is covered in this PR is the schema for mesh model policies, which was earlier not there. So basically, this schema allows us to have consistency over our code base. So when new policies are defined, so we can use the same schema, and so there are less discrepancies in new policies. So this schema also takes care of that. I've also already resolved all the comments that Abhi had. I just like there was only one pending item on this, that is where should these be stored and what should be the flow if we want to bring back the .repo files, and we have to just keep the JSON file for like just for the server time and then delete it after that. So this is the thing which I wanted to discuss. So Abhi, like, do you have, did we like, I think we didn't never completed the discussion on this. So if you have any suggestion on this.
Yeah, I think we last talked about when we last talked about it. So there were different ideas that we have. We needed some thoughts. So 2-3 approaches that we could follow is load the JSON file on the boot up, delete after the boot, after the shutdown of the Meshery server. The second approach we discussed was whenever there is change in the policies, policy files or Rego files, user can manually add that policy. The third consideration that is really important for us is to provide developer support as well. Like developer in future could add their policies dynamically through UI or somewhere else, and it should be just loaded as fine as the pre-built policies are loading. So based on 2-3 different concerns, like yeah, we might have skipped that conversation at that time, but there were 3-4 considerations that we have to take, and any approach would be fine based on what we want to achieve here, like how it should go. If the third item isn't a concern, like I think just like we load the components and models and categories and relationships, like policies could be loaded the same way on the boot up. If there is not if we don't require any dynamicism while adding up policies, or like at least for now we don't require it. So yeah, the approach that Pranav shared could work fine.
Yeah, it's probably worth us spending time to dig into this a little bit. This affects a lot of things, and it affects one of the things that Abdullah might work on. We'll see, and that is trying to create new integrations. Right now, that's fairly heavily driven from a Google Sheet, which is super convenient for the time being. I think that there might just be one technical hurdle that's at the crux of trying to provide for like two different requirements here. Like, well, on one hand, there's the requirement is the wrong word. We're trying to provide for two different use cases. One is for the contributor, the developer of a Rego policy, and the other one is for the programmatic handling of the Rego policy as it's loaded into Meshery server. So when mesh models, which contain components and relationships and now policies, when they're imported into Meshery server persists those into database. So there's a few tables that it updates. And when a policy is imported, well, there's the contents of that policy, which would be, there's the Rego policy, but there's also metadata about the Rego policy. So the mesh, like the mesh model there, this is actually the metadata right there, which is why Pranav is showing it. But the mesh model metadata, I'm sorry, the mesh model policy is lines 2 through 19. And that's the Meshery construct called a policy, a mesh model policy. And there's information about what this particular policy is for. It's a network type policy, and there's a description about what it's for. The expression, the way that we express this policy is we're doing it using Rego. Okay, so the policy is, the mesh model policy is really two parts, or it's ultimately you'd want to just think of it as one part, like it's a mesh model policy, which there's metadata about, and there's an expression for what the policy is supposed to, evaluate. Well, in order, okay, fine. So when you import that into Meshery server, it persists it to a database table. Great. If the full expression, the contents of the expression are inside of that table, great. Easy enough for the Golang handlers to retrieve it, to pull that up, evaluate it, maybe send it to OPA or use OPA libraries to evaluate the policy, etc. But on the other hand, as a contributor, if you want to modify that expression, well, it's a bit more convenient if it's available in a .rego file, if the expression itself is somewhat separate from the rest of the metadata, or if the expression itself isn't marked up with a \n and new line returns and other artifacts. Yeah, so it's convenient to have a .rego file resident as part of the source. Right now, Pranav, it sounds like you've got a script that will take a .rego file,
Yes, it can take the Rego file and can convert it into this JSON file. So I can add that in the script folder where we store other scripts for generating our components nightly through this workflow. So I just wanted to confirm, do we want to go with that approach where we use that workflow to generate the JSON file, like we use it for generating components?
Yeah, yes, like following in line with the current tooling and the current tooling flow. Yes. It doesn't mean that current tooling flow shouldn't change at some point. Like maybe it won't be driven through a sheet. Maybe it will be some central database that's running, something else. I don't know. Yeah, I'm trying to think of the issue with that. Like the issue is, hey, as a developer, if you modify the policy and then you want to go test it, to make sure that that expression is, the new expression that you've changed behaves as you intended. Well, so you modify the Rego, then you execute a command line, you do a build. Basically, part of that build, there would be a make command, probably specific to component generation, which would, and maybe one that's specific to policies. So it would go about doing a quick build, quote unquote, build of your policy. You'd then either need to import it or the make command would need to import it. So it's really the developer experience. I think that's the concern, and it's a legitimate concern. Yeah. It doesn't seem too terrible if there is a make command for reformatting and importing. I mean, there can be a make command for the reformatting because you'll have a script, sure. But then the importing, okay, well, that, like today, I don't know that we have a make command for importing. It just, yeah. In order to import new components, you
have to restart the server also.
Yeah,
I think.
And so we could improve that. I mean, an improvement there would be an improvement not just for policies, but for all of the models, so that you could have a make command to either invoke the API or to just invoke the that startup function, that on boot function, without it having to be on boot.
Okay.
That seems like a health. Yeah, I mean, if we argue against that, and it's taking a little while, but like it is a core part of what Meshery does. So if we argue against that, if we were to say, well, alternatively, what if we just left the expressions in .rego files themselves to make it super easy? There's no confusion about, just you go edit that and that's it. And actually that is actually what we're saying here is you go edit, there could be a .rego file sitting there. It's not implicated in the code. It's sitting there for convenience of the contributor to go modify. They go modify it. The build process sources from there. It doesn't directly use, once it's imported, it's not directly used. The other way would be to not have the expression directly stored in the database, or to have that the database point to the location on disk where the .rego file is. And I don't know so what would that do? Eliminate the quick make step to reformat the rego to JSON? Because you'd still have to have a make step when you're developing to perform an import, a reload of your policies. So Bobby, can you think of anything else like that would be negative about going down the first path of what I described?
It's not. I don't have any, thoughts right now. Like.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, what I just said was a whole bunch of jumbled up words that may not have made a ton of sense anyway. So, okay, maybe I'll try to articulate that in a diagram or something as well, just so that others can digest it. And at the moment, it sounds like we might go with option A, or the option that's described here.
Okay. So yeah, we would be using a script, and then we would be generating the .json from the rego file. I'll add secondary make command.
Right now, what you are doing? You are
right
running
now
the script on boot up?
No, what I've done right now is, first of all, I've just converted the repo file that you added to this JSON. And now this JSON would be like stored forever. Like we would be using the JSON first, like using it, storing into a database. Because like for storing, we require JSON so that we can unmarshal and marshal. So that is good.
Yeah. Okay. I'll put some comments in the PR. I have few. So yeah.
All right. Thanks, Pranav. It was a nice update. So moving on, next we have update from Abdullah on docs on creating a Meshery integration, K8s GPT integration. Abdullah, would like to share?
Yes. So I was trying to create an integration for K8s GPT, and I was looking for documentation that might help me get started with this. But I found that there isn't really any documentation that would let someone. There isn't any documentation that could get someone started with creating an integration, any kind of integration for Meshery. So we require documentation, and anyone who is familiar with creating integrations can maybe help in this effort. I've gone through the Meshery drive, and there is a bunch of resources on what mesh models are and how they work. But I was unable to find anything that would lead me in creating a new mesh model.
I think ideally you would require a Helm chart for that, like the location of the Helm chart, and if you refer to the integration spreadsheet where we actually like document different fields which are required for a mesh model, whether it's the icon that we will be using for our like icons we use for our rendering in the UI and things like that. So that is one of the different way like you can like see how it's already implemented, and based on that you can go forward with it.
Nice. Yeah, Abdullah. I mean, like what Pranav said is quite helpful, and it is like, hey, based on what's available today, here's how you might reverse engineer isn't quite accurate, but here's how you might go about figuring it out by yourself, kind of thing. And it's very helpful, and he's doing the right thing. But I also say, yeah, what Abdullah is calling out is the fact that if we were to visit the docs.meshery.io, there's a collection of pages in the docs that refer to extensibility. And so I dropped a link to that in the Zoom chat. The extensibility talks about, there's a variety of extension points, and the diagram that's shown in the extensibility docs page, the diagram has a few yellow boxes, and they point out extension points. And so sort of waiting for Abdullah to visit the docs, or somebody could share.
Me open up the chat. 1 second. Okay, found it. Okay.
You'll steal the share back just as soon as. So yeah, there's a page on there's a section on extensibility. When you, on the left-hand side, when you scroll to the bottom, extensibility, and there are a number of extension points. This is an old diagram, or an old copy of the diagram, rather. There have been more extension points added, I think, since the last snapshot of this slide that's available in the architecture deck, which I think we're going to talk about today. There's probably more of these extension points. And to Abdullah's point, great, there's information about how to build a new Meshery adapter. There's information about the 2 different APIs that we have, that Meshery has, the GraphQL API, the REST API. There's information about what a remote provider is and what interfaces you need to uphold if you're going to build a provider, how UI, what the different types of UI plugins are, et cetera. However, for the type of integration, the type of extension that Abdullah is considering, it's like, well, we need a whole nother section. And so, yeah, this is actually a fairly old entry here. And this probably needs we need to describe this, and we need to describe how to create these new mesh model style integrations. And Abdullah isn't the first to ask. It was, I think is Open Nebula, their graph database project. They had asked recently, hey, how do we make sure we've got a nice integration with Open Nebula, with Meshery? And so for my part, I'll be helping fill in those docs, get some of that written. It'll work out well, Abdullah, that you can maybe offer a review as those come around. So you can, as a way of familiarizing and correcting all of my grammatical mistakes. Yeah, and that's like between us adding more docs and then what Pranav said is sort of in the meantime, until those docs are there, here's how you might go about, trying to figure it out. Yeah, but we should do that today. Like, we should do it pretty fast. And it's, it might for most of those integrations, it's probably easier than it looks, which is nice. Abdullah, did you have, okay, but that was your core question. That was your core point. Yeah. Just at the crux of what Pranav was saying about where a lot of the definitions for these integrations, where they're driven from, that Meshery integrations spreadsheet, they're all actually itemized in that spreadsheet. Now, all of the details of the integrations, it's not all captured in there. There's just a ton, but yeah, but the high level details are all itemized. What color things should be, what icons, what the models are, what the components are. At some point, it'll be what the policies are, their relationships. Yeah, there's a fair bit to go describe. And it's a really good question. It's time to go document that. There will be mention of the spreadsheet, like the spreadsheet will be involved in that process. So for those that have seen the number of integrations that Meshery supports, we were just saying that all of those 220 or so integrations currently, they're all at a high level itemized in a Google Sheet. And for the most part, the majority of the components, the majority of the models that are integrated, that are supported, those are sourced from Artifact Hub, from Helm charts out there. Well, Artifact Hub isn't the only repository in town. There's a number of other, there's a number of other hubs where many other Helm charts are stored, many other Kubernetes resources. And that's really at the heart of this particular type of extension that Meshery has. The heart of it is Kubernetes CRDs, custom resource definitions. And so custom resource definitions are sometimes packaged and described inside of a Helm chart, particularly when you're deploying an operator for a given application. And so we're able to programmatically digest those, catalog them, put them into a sheet, and then import them into Meshery. So this spreadsheet is programmatically updated nightly with content from Artifact Hub. And then programmatically nightly as well, the content of the spreadsheet is refactored and put into the Meshery repo. So existing models are updated. So there's a bit of insight. We should have a diagram that shows that. So there's the workflow that drives it as well. Abdullah, other clarifying questions about that at the moment? So one thing you could do in the meantime is go verify the number of custom resource definitions in the Kate's GPT project. There might just be one. And just coming to learn that a little bit, whether it's 1 or 25, it's coming to understand what those custom resource definitions describe and how much, how far someone can get if they're able to visualize that. I think it's just one, but visualize that CRD and what can be configured within there. That'll be like, eventually that's what we need to do for all of the integrations that Meshery has, is further describe them and begin to begin to really help people with how they can use the individual components. One thing that Yash Tandon, who's not on the call, one thing that the project needs, and maybe this is for Tejas. By the way, Tejas, here in where I live in Texas, if you have a name like Tejas, that's Tejas. That's anyway. Tejas, with your focus towards DevOps and security and other things, something that the project needs is, well, it is a better definition of relationships between these integrations. So when you go to meshery.io and you see the grid of integrations that Meshery has, well, there are specific components, like if it's Postgres, maybe there's actually a number of Postgres integrations because there's a number of different Postgres providers for Kubernetes, Postgres operators. Well, within each one of these integrations, there are specific components. You can either, right now, all of those specific components are not documented in Meshery docs. That needs to change. Like there's a big, we should have an open issue about a call for help for taking the information that's in the spreadsheet and documenting it. That's already done, by the way. By the way, this site here and the Meshery, well, maybe just this site and the layer 5 site, they're both programmatically updated on a nightly basis as well, based on the information from that sheet. So as it turns out, there's a lot that's driven from that particular sheet. Well, that sheet has a bunch of details. It'll say, well, there's an integration with Kubernetes, for example, and Meshery supports the use of Kubernetes namespace, all these components, namespace, pods, deployments, services, all of the familiar components. Well, how does a namespace relate to a deployment? And in this case, a namespace, it is designed to be a parent of a deployment. So a namespace can contain a deployment. Thus far, the project has only itemized a handful of those relationships. And we need to go through and just in a non-code way, even, we just need to go through and say, oh, well, a pod is often a child of a deployment. Like, as a matter of fact, you don't really have a deployment unless you have at least like one pod. So there's a parent-child relationship there. That's not captured yet. Just that statement, that's work to be done. There's domain expertise needed for digesting these individual components and identifying how they should relate to one another so that that can be expressed here. And that doesn't have to be, those relationships would be codified, but the individuals identifying those relationships don't have to code it. Like, just somebody needs to highlight and suggest, here's how these two should relate. They should be able to have a line between them. They should be siblings, or whatever the relationships are. And there's inside that same spreadsheet, which Pranav has linked to in the Zoom chat, there is a sheet called K8's resources. And just to help get people started, like all of you on the call, we just took the list of 30 or 40 Kubernetes components, the resources in column A, and said, hey, here's some resources. How do each of these relate to one another? And so on line 6, the deployment has a parent-child relationship with namespace. Great. And that's all the coding that's needed. Like, there's no, that can be codified into the policies that Pranav was just referring to. Okay, well, what about CSI driver and CSI node? I'm sure that they're related somehow. They both have CSI in the, container storage interface. I don't know how are those related? Perhaps anyway, I won't suggest the answer, but so in column G, there's examples of different types of relationships that are supported currently. So I encourage, like, this is one of those things, is a great excuse to go learn more about either Kubernetes, and this is just the example, like, because all of the components that are in the first sheet, the Meshery integrations sheet, there are thousands. What a great excuse.
I'd like to work on this. Like, this sounds interesting to me, and I'll check the resources shared in the sheet as well as the integrations mentioned in the meshery.io/integrations. I'll check it and we'll discuss this further.
That's great. That's great. Yep. The nice thing is it can give you an excuse to go learn Azure API Gateway, or like there's tons of integrations to go pick from. The Kubernetes ones might be the most familiar to the majority of us. The examples these will certainly provide examples for everyone else that comes to work on the rest of the relationships, examples of like what kinds of relationships are possible, and what does it mean to be a parent-child relationship? What does that mean? So, good. Good.
By the way, last while we are integrating Kids GPT as a component and model inside our integrations list, so we have the use of Kids GPT in other ways, in other areas as well. For example, we do validation of design file, deployment of dry run, like all these things. I mean, I don't know if the license allows it to use it in our project, but there is a literally good amount of areas in the Meshery itself where we can improve the use of Kate GPT in our product, and we can, I mean, yeah, both of us can get help of each other.
Totally. We should probably put that on the roadmap somewhere. Like not too far from the policy engine, because what it would generate or what it might suggest wouldn't be too far removed from the concept of policies. Totally.
All right. So that was a nice discussion. So Tejas, you're up next with configure Nginx for Docker deployment.
Shall I share my screen or like just explain?
Yeah, sure. You can share.
Okay. I hope it is visible.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So let's just take a brief of this issue. Like the issue was simple. Like the HTTP Playground .meshery.io was not upgrading to or redirecting to HTTPS, and this was a simple and small fix for the Nginx in the for the Docker deployment specifically, and there were only a few changes. I have done this. The server which is listening at port 80, that is HTTP, then it is redirecting it to the HTTPS, that is 443. So there were a few changes, which I guess a few hours ago Pranav has already made those changes, and the PR is already merged. It is a small fix. I don't think I have much to discuss about it, but yeah, it was fun contributing. Yeah.
And yeah, just I wanted to add one more thing, that I've already added this configuration in our playground. So if you go to HTTP right now, so it will be redirected to HTTPS. There's one more documentation thing that I had to do, so that's in a separate PR.
All right. Yeah, that's all from my side.
All right. So before we move next, any more feedback for Tejas? All right. So next up we have an item from Lee on Meshery Playground, exposure of metrics and dashboards.
Yeah, having said that though, everybody's had to listen to my voice for entirely too long. Let's come back to me if there's time.
Sure. So Azan, you're up next on adapter controller design spec.
Okay. Let me share my screen. Yeah, this time I'm not going to make any finds, but I have written down like whatever discussions we had regarding this particular approach. Okay, I have mentioned some, like written down the deliverable objectives as well. Like this particular part is, I think only objective 1 is already complete. Like it, our current adapter management already succeeds in completing objective 1, but objective 2 remains to be done, and objective 1 of second goal 2. Like keeping these two in mind, we this could also have been done using help, but like keeping this in mind, we'll do it with controllers. The link to this is already there. I haven't like drawn any diagrams or anything because I did not know what to draw. So feel free to comment on it. I will continue the conversation there. Like also Lee, like if this looks fine, like I can make a barely functional one today, which like does simply deploy all the adapters. Like it won't provision deprovision, but a controller which will simply deploy all the adapters once it's, you know, like our current operator does. It simply deploys the meshing and broker.
Based on the presence of a CRD, like based on the presence of a custom resource being present. Nice. That sounds promising. Of what you might be able to initially deliver, of what you just referred to, is that are you able to leverage how much of that is boilerplate, so to speak, from the
like most of all the operators are like boilerplate only. Like you consider any operator, like most of it is boilerplate only. The only part that we write ourselves is the CRD part and reconciliation.
Nice. So, hey, remind me again, which framework are we using for our controllers for the operator?
Like, are you talking about controller at time, cube builder, or operator SDK?
Yeah, actually both. So it sounds like we're using both. So we're using operator SDK,
right.
And then cube builder for the controllers. Great. And then, yeah, I guess my question to ask it a little more specifically for of the example cube builder controllers, I got to imagine that this particular use case of ensuring that a deployment is running or a service is running is pretty status quo, pretty standard to what a controller would do. So my boilerplate question is like, hey, how much of that are you able to copy and paste? Like how much of that requires really any new code that wouldn't be available in the example?
Which example?
Cube builders controllers. Like, because it's
I'll have to check cube builders examples.
Okay, yeah, we want to let's use those too. Like let's not write our own stuff if we can. Every operator, not every operator, but the vast majority of them want to run a pod. Like they want to manage some application running on Kubernetes. So if it's a Postgres operator, they might want to be running a Postgres server. That would probably be a container inside of a pod. And while the operators might do all kinds of different things, like that use case is at the core of not every, but the majority of control, operators. And so we shouldn't have to.
Yeah, but like operators don't really get into that logic. They just like.
Okay, so I guess when I say operators, I mean controllers. What I'm suggesting is you shouldn't really have to lift much of a finger. There should be sample code, like sample templates, play stuff. The mainstream example of what a controller does should be this. Okay, so I guess my challenge to you is to like identify what you think the best template is, and see how little you can write, I think.
Like deviate the I don't know, smallest bit from the standard. That's what you want to say.
Yeah, well, or rather, see how you can write the smallest bit. You use whatever it takes from the standard examples, the standard template, and yeah, cut out anything that we don't need. But I'd be surprised if you needed to write any code other than just naming the custom resource that identifies which deployment to run.
Okay.
By the way, while the current list of adapters only includes service meshes and list of it, are we free to add adapters from some different categories? Like just some time back, we are talking about Gates GPT. I think that could be added as an adapter as well. Other than that, the things that we deploy, like we are writing our own conciliation or a controller or operator right now. So the things that we deploy, the resources that we deploy through Meshery, we don't have right now any logic to identify like which things are deployed by Meshery and which are not. So since we are developing or rewriting the design spec over controller and operators, like yeah, should those resources which are deployed by Meshery at least should be managed by the our own reconciliation algorithm or our own controllers, or maybe with a new adapter, like anything of that sort. We can think about it.
Totally. Yeah, there's been design for that. It's a mesh sync ID, and the ability to propagate that ID as an annotation to the extent that Meshery, that the deployment of a deployment, the deployment of a pod was greenfield, like to the extent that Meshery was the one to start it, that it should annotate it and be able to track it. So that what Abhi just said is true. There is that actually should be implemented now. Like that it should be the case that there is a mesh sync ID that's being annotated on objects that Meshery is deploying. But we're not doing anything about it. I don't think as that information gets returned. I do think that that's a step too far for what for the conceptual understanding that Azan has at the moment. But yeah, you're right. And one point to take away from what Abhi had said was that if we're referencing service mesh in here, we probably shouldn't, because this really isn't about service mesh. Cool. So at this point, it's happenstance that Meshery adapters speak to service meshes, but that the reality is they could be provisioning anything.
Given that the interface, the adapter interface is implemented for them. Like we have an interface for an adapter, like these methods need to be implemented by that adapter, and that's all we need, right? Am I audible?
Yep. Yep, I didn't hear you for my part. I mean, yep, it just needs to deploy Meshery adapters.
Oh, okay.
All right. Thanks, Azan. So Usman, you're up next on discussion on permission framework.
It's not a discussion, basically. We just have to decide on the approach.
Okay, sorry, decision on permission framework. Would like to share?
Okay, I can share, yeah. Let me share. Is my screen visible?
Yep, it is.
Okay. So yeah, there were two approaches. First approach was to hard code, and this design spec is related to the approach. The first approach. The second approach was to assign IDs dynamically by running a script to every UI element. I have the POC for that too, but this design spec is not related to that approach. We just have to decide on which approach we should move on. Abhi and Lee have something to say.
Yeah. So were you able to identify that there's not really a performance consideration? There's not a performance concern to consider?
There shouldn't be there shouldn't be a performance concern. But yeah, the code would become a lot messier because a lot
Sure.
messier. Yeah.
Okay.
To my part, just I think the thing, the permission framework would only control the things that are actionable by the user. Is that true?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So the only thing that I'm standing on is that like there are countable number of actionable items, like very little, or in comparison to the number of elements that we have available on the as a DOM element or in the DOM tree, or the number of nodes available in the DOM tree. Like the ratio would be around 5%, 6% of the actionable item on the whole DOM tree. So if we are just polluting everything with the UIDs here and there, because you might be using UUIDs, right? In order to assign IDs to each and every DOM elements. So yeah, that was my point. Like, why do we require to do it if there is just uh, yeah, a handful of actionable items? Like we may just identify all the actionable items because we are the creator of that code, so we know like what the items are actionable and what are not. Input fields, buttons, some other items like drop downs, all these things are actionable. So we might just identify it. Like, yeah, it would be some initial effort, but with time, whenever we are developing it, like we could include this as a part of our development process, or yeah, as a review process, to include IDs or whatnot. So yeah, that's what my take is on this area.
You are right. That's the point. Dynamic IDs assignment, that would be a lot of refactor. That would be if in future we need that. So yeah, my take is this is your mistake. So we have to decide on how we have to proceed now. There is a little bit of refactoring required on the backend too. So like, who would be working with me on the backend?
Maybe I'll chat with you in Slack after the call about trying to get you partnered up. I mean, it seems like, I think what we just, so there's a time check here, but I think what we were just concluding is that there would just be manually assigned IDs for the moment, and to kind of start slowly, start with a few manual ones, get that framework in place, show its usefulness, and then step back to consider whether or not a pervasive dynamic assignment of IDs to every element is warranted.
Yeah, all right.
Abhi, does that sound about right? Is that what you were thinking?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Good. So Suhail would like to discuss the OPA integration with Meshery. Do we have Suhail on the call?
Yeah, Gaurav, could you share this? I have shared the link of the issue. Yeah, so basically there were some question I have to ask regarding this issue. So as the issue description says that user authorization for mesh map. So will there be a central position from where the Rego policy will be evaluated, and based on that, if a user has access to mesh map, or if he is authorized, it will be evaluated, and based on that, to which endpoint the user has the access. Does we have to do that or something else, or other user capabilities?
By the way, yeah, as Lee is saying, like we just discussed about the authorization and control based UI and user experience. So yeah, we would cater all those things with the help of Castle, uh, which is a different framework built for this only use case. So might be we won't be moving with the OPA policies for access control or yeah, UI control or anything like that. Yeah, while yeah, Lee, you may proceed.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's easy. It's an easy thing to overlook. But if you consider okay, so we're going to take the next 3 minutes on this, which I think is quite helpful. There's folks like Noreen, who's on the call, that I have a particular amount of guilt when I think of Noreen, because there's a few things that she's trying to work on that I feel like enough dialogue hasn't gone on for her or others like Suhail to make progress on. And that's, please understand that that's entirely out of time or the lack of time. In this particular case, if you consider that what Usman was just working on, he was just saying, hey, in Meshery UI, when people sign in with different roles, there really isn't a framework or a system to identify which roles have which permissions. And consequently, when someone signs in with a given role, which buttons should they be allowed to click? Or which pages should they be allowed to see? Or which aspect of like a performance profile should they be able to edit it or not? And so there needs to be a framework for that. And so there's a design spec out there that's open for comment now. Great. That it's easy to think that particular effort is about enforcement of permissions and control. And well, it kind of is, although it's really about user experience in the UI, the user experience of helping ensure that someone sees what they're supposed to see, or that a button is turned enabled or disabled based on whether or not they're able to invoke it or not. Because and that's more about UX. It's really not about enforcement of permissions, because you're not able to enforce permissions client side in JavaScript. It's not gonna happen. So the actual enforcement needs to happen server side. Okay, well, as we look to interpret the permissions or interpret what role a user has and what permissions are associated to that role, that there would, on the server side, that would be the moment in time in which those permissions are discerned and a request to, a button click request is either processed or not. Well, so as you consider a framework on the back end for how to evaluate whether or not permissions are present and this user should be allowed to take this action, well, Open Policy Agent and Rigo is one of the tools that could be used to do that. And so part of our initial analysis for which policy expression language to use and which policy evaluation engine to use, there were a few considered. OPA ended up being the one selected because the intention is to use it about 3 times over and really gain from the economies of scope of its use and of all of us, all of the folks contributing to the project becoming quite savvy, hopefully at some point, with Open Policy Agent or with Rigo. And so, yeah, if you think about Usman on the back end of the individuals to coordinate with and to evaluate, to enforce these permissions, that ideally that would be done with OPA and Rigo expressions. And so, Suhail, that in part hopefully speaks toward a little bit more of what you're looking for, of like what this is about and how to go do that. So there's Abi has an example of an integration of Open Policy Agent as a Golang library to evaluate a Rigo policy handed to it. And so in the same way, when a user goes to click a button, we need to have policies there to evaluate whether that's authorized or not. So it's a great use case for, it's a very commonplace use case for OPA.
Okay. We are talking about combining both. In some ways, yeah.
Yeah, be able to use the same policy engine for different purposes, for different use cases. One for authorization use cases of what you could, what people can do, users of Meshery can do within Meshery as an app. Evaluation of what users can do to infrastructure that Meshery manages. Are they allowed to provision a new deployment into that cluster or not? As an example. The third way then as running in Wasm client side to be able to evaluate complex expressions for an extension like MeshMap. So those are the three ways that we think we can integrate and use that tech. So, Suhail, fortunately, you've picked the most conventional use, the most conventional way for OPA. Suhail, I expect you probably have more questions. And it's like, I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah. So I have written some Rigo policies. So there were some questions related to file structure. Like there were already a mesh directory in mesh model named policies. So I am writing the policies over there. So is it the good case or I should change it?
Yeah, let's one of the maintainers should take an action item to really clarify the three use cases that I just said and help offer some guidance. That might be the best place for you to start, Suhail. And it actually refers back to what we were talking about earlier on the call with relationships and defining new relationships. The relationships, when I said that we needed to identify a parent-child relationship between something like a namespace and a deployment, well, that is defined, that would be the policy that would actually evaluate that relationship is expressed in Rigo. And that is the same Rigo that you're looking at right now in Mesh Model. So yeah, it might make sense for you to continue to focus onto that use case and onto the way in which we're defining new relationships. So if a CSI driver is related to a CSI node in some way, there needs to be an expression that evaluates that. And so, yeah, we'll try to get this better described. I think we'd had long discussions with Polak, who made many promises about what he would do. I don't think he's around anymore. So yeah, we'll write it down. That'll teach us for verbally explaining things and not writing them down.
Alrighty. So we are 5 minutes over and we missed a couple of items. So if you need feedback, make sure to drop your items with links on Slack. And we'll be covering these items on priority in next meeting. So let's call this meeting a wrap. So thank you all for joining today's Meshery development meeting. You can catch the recording at Live5 YouTube channel. And make sure to subscribe the community calendar so you not miss any of the meetings. So thanks again. Thank you all for joining. We'll meet you next week, same time, same place. Bye all.